Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom and our continuing discussion of the lead up to World War I, right? We are going to be cruising through some content in this Flip and talking about leading up to when the war finally gets declared, right? But we left off in class talking about the main key points or the main causes of World War I, right? And shout out to first period, fifth period. Y'all are doing great stuff. Love the participation last class. Had an absolute blast with y'all last class. Had kids like Kenzie Burgess over there in the corner firing off great answers. Had girls like Lena Justice in first period firing off great answers as well. So keep up the good work and keep focused, okay? But let's go ahead and dive headfirst back into it. We left off talking about alliances, right? Now, alliances is a pretty simple thing that you can really easily discuss going into a war, but it's basically just an agreement between two countries, right? Now, of course, y'all as Catholic school kids are really, really nice about it, and you're like, oh, it means support, but it also can mean we're about to fight, right? Okay, not each other, but other people who want to fight us. Now, the thing about the alliance system that ends up leading to World War I is it all starts with Bismarck, right? Y'all remember Bismarck, right? Otto von Bismarck, right? Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Prussia and the eventual Chancellor of the German Empire. Well, he gets the entire ball rolling with the alliances, but he actually did it in a way that was smart, that could have actually saved everybody from a really, really cataclysmic war that ends up breaking out. Because he created this early on alliance known as the League of Three Emperors, right? And in the League of Three Emperors was Austria, Russia, and Germany, right? Now, the thing about it, though, and it was called Three Emperors because they were all three empires, right? The German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire, all also led by three emperors. You got Alexander the Third, there we go. Alexander the Third, Kaiser Wilhelm the First, and then Franz Joseph over in Austria. However, the problem with this alliance, though, is it does end up falling apart, right? Mostly due to the fact that there is some internal dissent within it. Now, Bismarck wanted to keep this alliance going just because it had a geographic advantage, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But the thing also that they couldn't figure out is that there was this movement going around called Pan-Slavism, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this Flip. Now, the thing and the reason why it falls apart is because Russia and Austria just couldn't get along, okay? Russia and Austria start arguing over this group of people called Slavs, right? And Slavs, or Slavic people, live predominantly in what is Russia and also Eastern Europe and down in the Balkans, right? Well, the Austrians control a bunch of Slavic people, including Bosnians, right? Albanians, and some other people like Croatians as well. Now, they end up getting into a big argument because Russia's like, hey, I'm Slavic, they're Slavic, let those Slavs go, I support them, right? And Austria's like, no! And they just refuse to do it, okay? And so they can't really get along, and then this new guy comes into power, right? Kaiser Wilhelm II, who's a very important figure that you need to highlight his name. He comes into power as the new emperor of Germany, and he fires Bismarck, right? And actually pushes Russia out of this original alliance of three emperors, right? Well, the alliance of three emperors also expired. You had to renew alliances every so often, and he refused to actually renew it, making him a turd. And he fired Bismarck, and Bismarck is one of the best politicians that the world had ever seen. But now that means that Russia is out there in the mist with no allies, because Germany allied with Austria and picked them in this entire argument. And so what ends up happening is France signs an alliance with Russia, right? They swoop in and sign an alliance with Russia, mostly due to the fact that France doesn't like Germany, right? The core dissent or the internal problem with all these alliance systems really boils down to one thing. France don't like Germany, Germany don't like France, right? And so Germany and France are going to lead to this entire war because of the alliance systems that they create against one another, right? So the very first alliance that gets created going into World War I is this thing known as the Triple Alliance, right? And it's going to be Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, right? Now, some of you are like, Mr. Terry, I'm confused, though, because I see the German kid, the Austrian kid, and the Italian kid, but who the heck is this kid over here? That dude right there is actually the Ottoman Empire, who joins the war in about October of 1914. Just keep that in the back of your mind, right? The Ottomans also join up with this alliance a little bit later on. But their nickname, or they're also known as, their AKA, is the Central Powers, right? Now, the reason why they were called Central Powers has a lot to do with geography, but we'll get into that in a little bit, okay? Now, going into it, though, that is their nickname, just like the Allies were known as the Allies in World War II. Everybody's got a nickname, right? But it's really, really confusing, though, because the Triple Alliance is also known as the Central Powers, but the Triple Entente, which is France, Russia, and Great Britain, who you traditionally know as the Allies, right? There you go, is going to be the Allies, while the Triple Alliance is the Central Powers. Don't let it confuse you too much, though, okay? But what's going to end up happening is after France signs an alliance with Russia, they're going to run off and they're going to sign an alliance with Great Britain as well, because Great Britain gets really, really frustrated with Germany due to another event that we're about to talk about here in a little bit. But France, Russia, and Great Britain end up signing a three-way alliance where France signs an alliance with Russia and Great Britain, and then Great Britain signs an alliance with France and Russia, and then Russia signs alliances with them, and so it's just kind of this big circle. That's why it's referred to as the Triple Entente, because it's not a formal alliance that bonded all three together. It was a series of different alliances that bonded together. And what an entente is, just so you know, E-N-T-E-N-T, is just an informal agreement, right? Basically, it's like a handshake agreement, and what ends up happening is they form the Triple Entente, because of those series of alliances that bonded them together, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, is this right here is your map of what you're going to kind of be looking at when the war does finally start. You've got the Allied powers in red. Now, some of you are like, but wait a minute, Mr. Terry, I thought you said Italy was with Germany. They were, but at the very, very beginning of the war, they switched sides, all right? Jot that down. They switched sides, right? Italy is going to be like, I don't want to be on this side, and then jumps over to the other side, so they actually join the Allies. They do the same thing in World War II as well, but they do it a little bit later on during the war itself. And then you've got the Central Powers that are located here in blue, right? The Ottomans over here, of course, it says Turkish Empire right here, but it's the Ottomans. And they're called the Central Powers because they're located centrally in Europe, right? Now, these allies or these alliance systems are going to be a very important key starter to the entire war. But another massive reason why this war ends up blowing up, literally and figuratively, in everybody else's face, has a lot to do with this concept called militarism, right? Now, what militarism is it's basically a byproduct of the economic competition that's been going on throughout Europe during the late 1800s and early 1900s. Because this economic competition between countries and wanting to be the biggest, the best, most powerful, and the most successfully economic is going to be a really, really important thing that creates a big amount of tension. For example, we talked about one famous family, the Krupp family, right? The K-R-U-P-P. They are an element of this economic competition, right? The Krupp family became the richest family in all of Germany and also one of the richest families in the entire world during the 1900s because of the military weapons that they sold to the Germans and then also to even other powers as well. But they're a great example of this militarism because economic competition, when it overflows, leads countries to practicing militarism, which is a glorification or glory or building up of your military, right? Because so many countries had excess amounts of money coming in, they decided to invest it heavily into their military. They invest it heavily into research and development of their military, making their military as large and as intense as they possibly can, and buying a lot of different weapons from that Krupp family, right? And also, what you have to understand is this is a really good example of the new industrial military. Militarism is also going to be blowing up during this time in the 1900s because the Industrial Revolution has now really set in, right? Actually, when you really make the argument, the second wave of the Industrial Revolution has really set in because the second wave of the Industrial Revolution happens from about 1850 to about 1914, 1915, okay? And it's where everything that was created in the Industrial Revolution becomes more refined, more gear-oriented, more efficient, more systematic, more mechanized, right? And so a good example of this new industrial military that these countries are now investing a lot of money in and building up is a really great example, of course, is the Maxim gun, which was developed in the 1880s fully, right? And we already know about the Maxim gun, right? That little guy right there is by the name of Hiram Maxim. He is the British scientist that actually developed the thing, and it's going to fire 600 rounds a minute and is going to put those old muskets and repeating rifles to shame, right? So the thing is that this gun, though, this Maxim gun, will be the weapon that defines World War I and sends them into a trench warfare, okay? So it's a really good example of this because the Industrial Revolution was going to change the way that warfare in the world is ever, actually fought a war. Wait, let me rephrase. How do I say that better? Let's try that again. The Industrial Revolution is going to change the face and shape of warfare forever, right? Because you're going to see automatic weapons coming out. During the war itself, you're going to see developments and militaristic developments of new weapons like poisonous gas and stuff like that. And couple it with also the other things that had already been growing from the Industrial Revolution. Now supplies are getting to the front lines way faster than they ever have because they're using locomotives, right? Now messages are getting all the way everywhere through different militaries way faster because of Samuel Morse and his telegraph, right? And then also steamboats are now getting soldiers to new destinations to fight these wars even faster, right? Now, another big example of this industrial militarism or the industrial warfare complex that's going on, you could see in this big event known as the Naval Arms Race, also known as the Anglo-German Arms Race. Now, for those of you who don't know what an arms race is when two countries compete with each other to try and build up as many weapons as possible and to have more than the other guy. That's the big key here, right? To have more than the other guy. Now, interestingly enough, this right here is the event that broke any kind of good relationship the Germans and the British had and sent Britain over to France and got them to sign an alliance with France, right? So the Anglo-German Arms Race, or this naval arms race, was a really, really big problem because it basically made Great Britain and Germany kind of not hate each other. But it's also, again, going to change the face of warfare because it's an aspect of that militarism, right? Investing a lot of money in your military. Where you could see that is the British began to build up a very new special kind of boat, right? There is a boat referred to as a dreadnought, right? That the British are going to invent that is a destroyer-class battleship powered by steam engines with massive guns that actually exist on the front, back, sides of it, everywhere. And it's going to change the face of naval warfare because these things could roll up just about anywhere and fire from a great distance and hit targets inland, right? That's why it was referred to as the dreadnought, right? Because it was moving at a terrifying speed with terrifying force, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is that the very first one was called the HMS Dreadnought, and then it led to all of them being called dreadnoughts. But what also ends up happening, though, is that Germany tries to build up dreadnoughts as well. They were like, we're not going to allow the British to have more of these boats than we are, and the Germans attempt to build them up. But unfortunately, what ends up happening is in this arms race, the Germans just can't quite get there, right? They can't quite get there, and the British end up beating them. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain. They're the ones who developed them, so they had some leg time and a fresh head start on them. And another big reason why is that because Britain was heavily invested in building up their naval prowess and power like they always had been, right? So what the Germans are going to do is they're going to try to double down on another type of boat, right? Now, the double down on that, I mean, is like kind of put a bunch of money on a different type of boat, right? And the Germans start investing in these things called Unterseeboots. Unterseebooten, actually. Unterseebooten ist eine Villa Unterseeboot. Unterseeboot ist ein Unterseeboot, yeah? So now look, so basically what I'm saying is Unterseeboot is a U-boat, right? A U-boat is another fancy word for a submarine, right? Now, everybody laughed at Germany when they were doing this, right? And Germans were like, oh, hey, if they got the dreadnoughts, we're going to make the boats that no one can see. Well, the British are over there going, oh, we're going to enjoy our tea and crumpets, and we're not afraid of you at all, because Unterseeboots, or U-boats, or submarines, can't see anything, and radar hadn't been developed yet, so they literally had to kind of navigate blind, and they were like, there's no way that boat's going to be important. They were wrong, and that's going to be a really important development, and the Unterseeboots that the Germans developed is going to be majorly important the further into this war that we get, okay? So the other big aspect that you have to understand is the aspect of imperialism, right? Now, imperialism is going to be huge, okay? Because there is going to be a massive race to take over as many resource-producing colonies as possible. Now, this is our third cause of World War I, right? The imperial cause, or the imperialism cause. Now, this one's pretty obvious, though, right? When we looked at the scramble for Africa, the Berlin Conference, the expanse into Asia that the European powers are going to do in the late 1800s, you can see how there was literally a race to take over as many of these resource-producing colonies as possible because they believed that it would make them as much money as it possibly could, right? Now, the last but not least cause of of World War I is going to, of course, be nationalism. Now, nationalism is an interesting one because, of course, nationalism on its face, in its simple form, could definitely 110% be a cause of World War I, right? I mean, pride in your country and wanting to be better than everybody else can definitely lead to some sour resentment and lead to you actually wanting to start a fight to prove your worth and your actual, kind of prowess over someone. But there was an interesting element of nationalism that was running around in the 1900s that's going to be really, really important when it comes to how this whole thing went down, right? And what that is this area right here, right? So we just started talking about these guys a little bit ago, and who these folks are these people known as the Slavs, right? Now, the Slavic nations that you can see highlighted in that area right there. Let's get back to it. The Slavic nations that you can see highlighted in this area right here means that all of these different people from these countries speak Slavic languages or have Slavic cultures, okay? Now, really quickly, when we're talking about Slavic people, it means that they're a very, very different kind of cultural breed than the rest of Europe, okay? And especially these people down here, Southern Slavs that lived in this area that's referred to as the Balkans, right? You're talking about Serbians, Bosnians, Croatians, some Hungarians, not all of them. Serbians, Bosnians, and Croatians are the big ones. And then you've also got, no, not Romanians. They're not Slavic either. But anyway, now, going into it, though, there was a big trend that was growing in the 1900s. And it was a trend referred to as Pan-Slavism, right? And what Pan-Slavism is the belief that all Slavic people should unify and defend one another, right? And that Slavic people deserved their own countries and needed to stop being oppressed by people like the Austro-Hungarians and the Ottoman Empire, right? Now, what you have to understand is a bunch of these South Slavic nations, the ones that we just zoomed in on a little bit, places like Albania and Serbia and Montenegro and Croatia and Bosnia, were controlled by a lot of these other empires, Austro-Hungarians and the Ottomans in particular. But what's going on in the 1900s, unbeknownst to a lot of people, is the Ottoman Empire is shrinking aggressively, right? They're not as industrialized as everybody. They're not as their military is not as powerful as it once was, and so they're losing a lot of land and territory territory, and in that process, they're leaving a lot of this land open, and they're also losing a series of wars referred to as the Balkan Wars, right? So as the Ottoman Empire began to shrink, you saw new countries popping up like Serbia and Bulgaria and even Greece. They had a massive independence movement in the late 1800s that's going to be known as the Greek War for Independence, right, against the Ottoman Empire. But as they began to shrink and stuff like that, and the Ottoman Empire began losing land, these new Slavic countries are like, hey, everybody needs to let every Slavic go, and the Bosnians deserve to be free from Austrian control as well. And so that's your origin of Pan-Slavism, right? This right here is the map of like the Balkans after that first Balkan War, where as you can see, like I said, the Ottomans just keep getting smaller and smaller, and all these new countries start popping up, leading into a lot of aggression and a lot of like kind of testy feelings, right? Now, this, though, leads to that area, this whole nervousness, this pan-Slavic thing. By the way, keep in the back of your mind, who's the biggest Slavic country out there? None other than Russia. The Russians support all these people, right? The Russians are like, yeah, little cuz, yeah, you like do your own thing, become your own country. I got your back, right? Just remember that in the back of your head. Russians are Slavic as well, all right? But what ends up happening is due to the Ottoman Empire shrinking, Austrians trying to take new territory, all these new countries popping up, is this area in the Balkans starts being referred to as the powder keg, right? Now, the powder keg of what I just showed you is basically a metaphor, okay? Now, a metaphor to refer to the Balkans leading up to World War I because it was so unstable, right? Everybody referred to it as the powder keg because they were like, oh, these states are so unstable that any type of little sudden movement could send us into war, right? That one spark or one thing or one little flame that gets any too close to it could turn a small war into a really big one, right? Is why the Balkans referred to as a powder keg, because all these nationalistic tensions are making everybody really angry and making everybody itchy for war, right? Now, what's going to end up happening is this right here is the match that sends us in that direction, right? The match that lights the powder keg that explodes World War I into war, right? Because the war started with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, all right? Now, we're going to talk about Archduke Franz Ferdinand a little bit, all right? Who he is, where he was, when he was, why he was, right? So he is the second in line for the ruler, or actually the next in line. That's a better phrase, like saying it. Archduke Franz Ferdinand is the next in line ruler of Austria, right? The current ruler at the time was Franz Joseph. Write that down. Franz Joseph, right? F-R-A-N-Z. Joseph, J-O-S-E-P-H. Franz Joseph was the leader of Austria at the time. His nephew is Archduke Franz Ferdinand, right? And so the thing about it, though, is that Franz Ferdinand knows his uncle is very old, and is getting older. And he knows for a fact as well that the Austro-Hungarian Empire is very large and controls a bunch of these Slavic people. So the thing that you have to understand is he's very well aware of the Pan-Slavism, and he's very well aware of the dissent. He's very well aware that the Serbians don't like him and don't like his uncle either. But the thing about it is that Archduke Franz Ferdinand feels like, oh, well, I'm going to go to Bosnia, right? I'm going to go to Bosnia in June of 1914, and I want to go on a parade, right? And I want to go on a parade, and I want to show the Bosnian people why it's important to be with the Austro-Hungarians and why we're a great empire to be a part of, right? Which was really dumb, because there was a nationalist group that was going to show up and assassinate him, right? Because when he decides to go to Bosnia, right, specifically the city of Sarajevo, all right, he plans to visit that place on June 28th, 1914 for a parade, right? And a bunch of people are sitting around being like, you know, we really hate the Austrians, so this would be a really good time to kill that guy, right? And they take their opportunity, right? And the group of guys that ends up killing him and assassinating him is a group of young men, 6 of them, named Young Bosnia, right? They're a nationalist group from Serbia. They're actually Bosnian Serbs, right? So they're a type of Slavic person that's from one area, or like culturally like one type of Slav living in another area, okay? Now, what had ended up happening is this group of guys, very, very young dudes named Young Bosnia, actually gets a lot of money and training and assassination know-how from a group of people called the Black Hand, right? Which was a nationalist group in Serbia that had actually infiltrated the government and was using a lot of its political ties to manipulate the government and the way it was going, right? So what you have to understand is that the Black Hand gave money to these guys, Young Bosnia, to go out there and assassinate him, right? And assassinating people back in the day was really, really popular. It was like the cool TikTok trend that everybody was doing. So, and the reason why I bring that up is because Young Bosnia assassinated him, but for the rest of your life, if you're ever on Jeopardy, the Black Hand is what they're expecting you to say, all right? So, the Archduke had a visit to Bosnia planned for June 28th, 1914. Now, the plan that the Young Bosnian guys had come up with is that they were going to basically wait for the parade to pass by, and they were going to jump out of the crowd, right? And they were going to use several of them to keep the crowd back and also stop the car. They were just going to go booga, 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 and like stop the car to get it to slow down. And the 6th man was supposed to emerge with a grenade, dunk the grenade in the car, and kill the Archduke and his wife, right? Because his wife was with him as well. His wife is right there. Her name is Sophie, right? So yeah, Sophie Ferdinand. So now, like, what ends up happening though is Sophie and Archduke Franz Ferdinand, they don't die at that first assassination attempt. The guy that was supposed to dunk the grenade into the car accidentally decided to go Kobe on it, shot it into the car, missed, and it rolled into the crowd and actually hit some bystanders, right? And so that actually didn't work. And so plan B actually happens after the fact, right? What ends up going down is the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife go to visit people that were hit by the grenade in the hospital, right? And he then continues the parade after the fact. Franz. Very dumb idea, big fella. They continue the parade after the fact, and they decide to keep going, and what ends up happening is there was a car accident, and they turned right to avoid it. Well, turns out Gavrilo Princip, one of the 6 young men that was supposed to assassinate him in the first place with the grenade, that wasn't arrested, had gone to a cafe on a side street in Sarajevo. And he was sitting there, drinking a cup of coffee, some say eating a sandwich, and was relaxing, and the car came by. Just happened to come down the street that he was on, and apparently he jumped up out of his chair, pulled a revolver out of his jacket, and he assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife. Shot both of them. Shot Sophie and Franz Ferdinand, right? And Gavrilo Princip was a mere 19 years old, right? This is a picture of him getting arrested immediately after, right? All 6 men that were actually a part of the assassination attempt were arrested in the process, right? Now, what's going to end up happening, though, is right after this major event, is a series of events are going to come down the pipe that are going to really send Europe into a worldwide war, right? Because they just mishandled the living daylights out of it. Now, if you look at this, that should be just a war between Austria and maybe Serbia, right? A small conflict that wouldn't escalate too greatly. But the thing is that you got to combine all those causes, right? The militarism, the alliances, the imperialism, the nationalism all came together and coalesced into a war that started small but exploded into really, really big. And also, it's because they just really mishandled this whole thing, all right? So, right after Archduke Franz Ferdinand gets assassinated, there are 2 big things that happen, known as the July Crisis and the Blank Check. So the month that followed, June 28th, 1914, is going to be a really big deal, okay? Now, it's a really big deal because of this thing, all right? The blank check is yet another metaphor, referring to the fact that the Germans, right, Germany, told Austria, I will support you and back you up and do whatever you want to do when it comes to dealing with the Serbians after this assassination attempt. Now, they call that a blank check because if you have a blank check, you basically can fill it out for any amount that you want. So basically, Germany gave Austria the blank check, right? Of, oh, if you want to go to war, we'll go to war with you. You want to do nothing? We'll do nothing with you. Whatever you want to do, you do you. Which was a really bad idea because you shouldn't put the fate of the continent in the hands of alliances and a bunch of testy emperors, okay? So going into it, what ends up happening is then in July 1914, the month that followed, known as the July Crisis, write this down, this is the July Crisis, is Austria is going to issue 10 demands to Serbia, knowing they couldn't complete them, right? And then threatening to invade them if they didn't complete them, right? Austria was like, do this, do that, oust the Black Hand from your political organizations, demilitarize yourself, da-da-da-da. And the Serbians are like, there's no way we can do this. Are you crazy? That event right there, those 10 demands, is referred to as the July Crisis because it was this moment of tension that everybody started freaking out. And speaking of tension, the reason why it was so tense is because Russia wasn't having that, right? Russia, remember, is a Slavic country as well, and Pan-Slavism had been spreading really effectively. And so the Russians are like, don't you talk to my little guy like that, and starts mobilizing its military and preparing it for war. But remember, who is Austria's ally? Who sees Russia mobilizing? Who then begins to mobilize themselves for war? None other than the Germans, right? Because the alliance system then falls in on itself and leads us into worldwide war. Because Austria declared war on Serbia after the July Crisis, and then the alliances began to kick in, okay? What's going to end up happening is Germany declared war on Russia in a because Russia declared war on Austria, Germany declared war on Russia, and then Germany turned around and declared war on France out of nowhere because they knew that Russia was in an alliance with France, right? And by August, even Britain was involved in this war, and World War I had begun, right? But we'll talk about the first shots of the war that actually go down in our next class, and I'll see y'all soon.